I have been working at the Disability Office, or DRES. Prior to that, I was a school teacher in the K-12 setting. I worked mostly in Champaign Unit 4. The first couple of years that I taught, I was in the Danville area with VACE special education through there. But I taught for 14 years, deaf education. My undergrad is in deaf education from Illinois State University. And then my first master's degree is in educational administration. And then I received my National Boards Teacher Certification for Language Arts, Reading and Writing. And then I went on and got my second master's degree in Library Information Sciences here at the University of Illinois. I work currently as the access specialist who works with students on campus who are either blind, low vision, deaf and hard of hearing, or have speech disabilities. And the other part of my job is that I am the American Sign Language interpreter, coordinator / supervisor for campus, as well as the live captioning coordinator supervisor for campus. And interestingly enough, my family has a hereditary hearing loss so I started having a progressive hearing loss in my late 30s. So after years of working with people who are deaf and hard of hearing, I also started losing some of my hearing. So I do wear hearing aids and rely on captions for most things. So I thought that I would start off today talking a little bit about some preferred terminology. I know that when I first started teaching, I was politically correct by saying that I was a teacher for the hearing impaired, and I was that for many years. And then, of course, as times change and culture changes, politically correct terms change. And so now, instead of being called hearing impaired or vision impaired, the philosophy at DRES is that we listen to the person first terminology, that the disability doesn't necessarily always identify a person's identity. So we'll say a person with a disability, a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, a person who is blind. And so as you can see up here, I just threw some examples up here. Deaf and hard of hearing is now the preferred term instead of hearing impaired. Blind, low vision is the preferred term instead of vision impaired or the impaired in general. And I think the number one thing that I hear the most still is handicapped parking. And I think just as a side note, it should be accessible parking. Just if you can try to get some of those things into your vocabulary, it's always appreciated. I know it can be difficult to remember after so many years of doing one way in particular, but I think it's important. So I threw this slide up there for you just so that you could read through those very quickly. So when I was thinking about preparing for today and what I wanted to talk about, I thought it was best to just start with hearing loss and to explain a little bit about what that is, how it's measured. What does it mean when you say, I have this or that type of hearing loss? So this is where I decided to start today. I'm not going to spend too much time, but I did want to explain it. So up here on the right-hand side of my screen, you'll see that I have an image like a chart or a graph. This is actually called an audiogram. The audiogram measures across the top in hertz, which is pitch. So at this left side of the graph, it's a very, very, very low sound, starting around 125 hertz, which would be really, really low. I can't talk that low, of course, but 8,000 hertz is really, really, really high pitched. So we're talking about pitch as we go across the top of this graph. On the side of the graph, we're talking about loudness, which is measured in decibels. So really, really soft. If you are at 0 decibels, we're talking whispers, rustling leaves, that level of softness. And then at 120 decibels at the very bottom of the graph, we're talking about like airplanes going over your head, or that, like helicopters and that type of thing. So when you go to get your hearing tested, what they're doing is they're testing how well can you hear any given pitch. Usually they test between 250, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, and 8,000. The pitches, at these different levels of loudness and softness. And when they do this by testing one ear at a time, many of you have probably put the headphones on and had the little button that you push every time you hear something. And so they measure each ear individually. So that you can see at the bottom, they will plot, oh goodness, I'm sorry, I can't click. They will plot your left ear with an X. So when they measure at 250 hertz, they'll put an X wherever it is that your hearing falls on this graph. And they'll do the same thing at 500. So you'll have an X plotted and all the way to the end. And then for your right ear, they'll put an O wherever your hearing falls on this graph. And this is how audiologists know what your hearing is like. So I thought that I would explain this a little bit because I like this one because it's what we call a picture audiogram. And it kind of shows you where different sounds fall on this graph. So if you look up here at the top, if you hear everything, your right and your left ears, all the way across here at 0 decibels, you're hearing almost every single thing on this chart. You're hearing, sorry, I keep hitting that button. You're hearing all of these sounds. So you're hearing the leaves rustling, the birds chirping, a baby crying, vacuum cleaner, piano, dogs barking, lawnmowers, motorcycles, all of the things. And if you notice right up here at the top, there's in the middle of this graph is this kind of banana shape. And it is, that's where speech falls. And so the sound F makes F and S for the S and F for the TH. Those are very soft sounds. They occur right around 4,000 to 8,000 hertz at around 20 decibels. So your louder sounds like J is going to occur at 250 hertz around 40 decibels. So the point is, most people, if you look on the far right side here, who have normal hearing, can hear whenever their right and left ears are plotted, they can hear anything pretty much between 0 and about 25 decibels. So right through here. So they can hear all of these sounds and everything down below it. If you have a mild hearing loss, then your right and left ears will plot between 25 and 40 decibels, which is this kind of really light gray shade, which as you can see is right in the middle of this where speech occurs. Moderate hearing loss is between 40 and 60 decibels. The gradient gets darker with gray as we go down, which means you're not hearing any of the sounds above the line. You're only hearing the sounds below the line wherever your right and left ear plots. Moderate and moderate severe, it occurs between 55 and 70. A severe hearing loss is between 70 and 90. So if your right and left ears plot between this shaded area, you're only hearing the sounds below that. You're not hearing any of the sounds above that occur there. So I point this out because if you are hard of hearing, then you're considered to have a mild to severe. So your ears could plot anywhere between 25 decibels and 70 decibels, right in this main area, right through here. To be considered deaf, one or both of your ears will plot between the 70 and 120 decibels on the bottom end of the chart. So I personally have a mild to moderate hearing loss. And so my ears, both of mine plot between anywhere from 30 to 50 right through here. And what that means is that I don't hear the K sound. I don't hear the F or the S or the TH sound anymore. P sound. So if I say pig, I'm hearing I or ig. And so I think that that's important for just to share with people when we're talking about hearing loss, what that means for someone who's deaf or hard of hearing, or someone who's deaf, they're not hearing any of the speech sounds at all if their ears are both plotted near the bottom of this chart. So now I can finally move forward to the next slide. So I thought I would start talking about deaf culture just a little bit with babies. And before I even begin, I just wanted to say, I am not by any means the expert in deaf education, I'm sorry, deaf culture or deaf community. I do have a degree in deaf education, sorry, but I'm not an expert in deaf culture or deaf community because I was not born completely deaf. I was not born with American Sign Language being my first language, surrounded by other family members who were all also deaf. Most of my family members are hearing, and my dad's side has the progressive loss as we get older. So while I have had many interactions and I've been involved with the deaf community and the deaf culture since I was young, I'm not by any means an expert. So I just always want to start out with that. I'm just sharing with you today some of the things that I have learned and experienced throughout my life. So we're going to start with facts about deaf children and babies. So 90 to 95% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. And often, many times, those hearing parents don't know sign language or American Sign Language or any kind of sign language at all. And so it is, determined or believed that possibly up to as much as 70% of these deaf children are being deprived of ASL language. And that's because the focus is more on speech and residual hearing. And I say that because, of course, as hearing parents, if when you have a baby and you find out that the child has a hearing loss or maybe that they're profoundly deaf, it can be very difficult and it's scary sometimes to know what to do. Do I have to start learning ASL now? Some parents try, and learning a new language is always difficult, and so they drop it as the kids get a little older because they have full-time work. It's hard to take classes. I understand that, but I think to get into the concepts of deaf culture and deaf community, you have to understand this from the beginning. It's estimated that only about 40% of families that have school-age deaf children actually use sign language at home. And I think it's really important to note that speech reading is a talent or a skill, much like some people are born musical, others are not. Some people are born very athletic, others are not, or very artistic. It's the same thing. And so there's no guarantee that just because a deaf child is born deaf, that they will have the ability to do speech reading very well. Some may, but some may not. And so I think it's important to start with those concepts to begin with before we move into the rest. So next, that leads us to who is the deaf community? Who's involved? Well, the deaf community is culturally deaf people who use American Sign Language. Many people believe that this starts around and is centered around residential deaf schools. Every state has at least one residential school. Some of the larger states like California have two or maybe more, but the Illinois School for the Deaf in our state is located in Jacksonville, Illinois. And so when children are anywhere from the ages 5 through 18, they can go and live at the Illinois School for the Deaf. And some families choose that that's what they want to do. They want to make sure that their children have that access to language and learn ASL as their first language, their primary language. And so some families will choose to relocate and move near the deaf school so that they can live there and learn as a family about deaf culture. Other families are already at and around the deaf school because everyone in their family is deaf. Their grandparents are deaf, great grandparents are deaf. They've passed that language and the culture and traditions through their family to their children. And so most of the deaf communities definitely revolve around the residential schools. And when they graduate, they stay in the area. They give back to the schools. They're very involved with the residential schools. Now, deaf communities can also exist in other places of the state. Champaign-Urbana does have a deaf community. It's not as large maybe as other areas in the state, like in the Chicago suburbs. They've got several deaf communities up in that area, but we do have a deaf community in this area. So who else is involved in deaf community? That would be individuals who maybe are not deaf, but they use ASL and they value deaf culture. So I know this definition has absolutely changed throughout the years. But right now, I think I feel safe in saying, individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing or who use hearing aids or cochlear implants, but also use ASL are also involved and want to get to know the deaf community are accepted to do that. Sometimes you have deaf and hard of hearing children who their families, for whatever reason, can't move to the residential school. They have to stay where they're at because that's where their jobs are at. So the parents choose to have their children mainstreamed in the public schools, and they still learn sign language, and they use sign language throughout the public schools. Those students also are part of the deaf community, especially when they get older and they start getting more involved. And then if you have any hearing or hard of hearing parents, siblings, family members who also use ASL, they're also on the out fringes of part of the deaf community. The core center of deaf community, like I said, is deaf parents with deaf children, with deaf grandparents, where everyone, ASL is their first language. Now, interpreters for the deaf, audiologists, speech language pathologists who use ASL, they can also be involved in some ways in the deaf community as well. So ASL has been recognized as a actual language. It's linguistically defined as a language because it has rules, it has grammar, it has syntax, has semantics, all the things checklist and checkboxed underneath it to make, to ensure that it is a language because it has all of those parts. So ASL has been recognized as a language for many years now. And I think it's important to know that sign language is not universal. American Sign Language is used in the United States and in Canada. And in my experience, I've been all around the island of Jamaica. They actually have a great number of people in the population in Jamaica who have hereditary deafness. And so they've got 3 schools for the deaf, a deaf village down there, and they all use American Sign Language as well. But if you go to other countries, you're going to find that their countries have their own system of sign language. So you would think that even in Britain, that since it's English speaking, that would be an American Sign Language based country as well, but it's not. It's definitely got its own British Sign Language that actually uses a 2-handed alphabet. If you've been familiar or seen anything about ASL, you know that we have a 1-handed alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But the 2-handed alphabet, and I don't know it, it's like A, B, I don't know, it's 2-handed. I don't know any of it. So yeah, it's very different. But if you were to go to Ireland or Germany, it's German Sign Language or Japanese Sign Language. So it's not universal. That would be wonderful if it was, but it's not. The deaf community supports the belief that they have no impairment. And when they have deaf babies, they are thrilled, it's celebrated, because for the deaf community, that is what makes deaf culture. They believe very much so, and I agree, that the only thing that a deaf person can't do is hear. And so hearing people assume that means they can't communicate, but they have American Sign Language, which is recognized as a complete language. So they have a language, it's just not the same language that we use. So if all they can't do is hear, but they have a language, then is there really an impairment? In the deaf culture, they believe that there isn't an impairment because they have state residential schools for the deaf, where the deaf community really supports and works around their school for the deaf. And we have Gallaudet University. It's the very first liberal arts college for the deaf. It's located in Washington, D.C. So even past the K-12 setting, there's universities that they can go to that are where everyone is completely deaf. So they can get high school degrees, college degrees, and move forward, get jobs in the world and be successful and have families and drive and do all the things that all the rest of us do who are hearing. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest things to note about the deaf community, which I guess I'll go back just one more thing about that, which is one of the reasons why if 90 to 95% of all deaf babies are born to hearing parents, then you can see why if you're not hearing those sounds at all, there's got to be some kind of intervention there, right? So either hearing aids, cochlear implants, and then the child is going to spend a lot of time, most of their preschool, like 0 to 3 through probably age 10 or 12, working with speech language pathologists, audiologists, teachers for the deaf, where they're working on using whatever residual hearing that they have, learning how to speech read, and for some students, also learning ASL or like assigned English. ASL and English are not the same. There is a signed English system. ASL does not have English word orders. If you've ever taken a language before, like Spanish or German or French or whatever, you might be familiar when I say like the infinitive is usually at the end of the sentence. And so it's similar. The adjectives are facial expressions and body language in ASL. So there's a lot going on there to be taught all at the same time. And so parents have a big choice, many choices to make when they find out that their child is deaf. First, do we want to give any kind of amplification? Are we going to learn sign language? Are we going to be involved in the deaf community? Are we going to move near the residential school? Are we going to mainstream our children? Are we going to have them focus on speech only, or are we going to include speech and ASL together? Like there's just so many decisions to be made. So when we go on to deaf culture, some important tips to know are that when you're talking with people in deaf culture, deaf people can be very direct. They will say things and do things sometimes that hearing people are like, what? But it's absolutely acceptable. And I'm sorry, my dog is clearly barking at something in the background. So sorry. But they might do or say some things that's offensive to those in hearing. For example, they might walk up to you after not seeing you in several months and say, oh, you've got a new haircut. Why? That doesn't work for you. But that is something that they would say in deaf culture, and they wouldn't be offended for it. Or they might say, oh, I see you've put on a lot of weight. You're getting fat. Why is that happening? Or why aren't you working out? And again, that's just when your language, in hearing culture, we beat around the bush. We're really where we say things without coming out and saying things. There's no room for that in deaf culture. Like you're just very direct, just say what you want to say. Otherwise, I don't know what you're talking about. And so those types of things will happen. So if you ever decide to get involved with the deaf community, just be aware of that. Deaf people are not being rude. They're not trying to hurt your feelings. They're just being very direct, and that is part of their culture. They look at each other's faces and facial expressions and body language and maybe mouth, depending on their training and upbringing, but not necessarily their hands while we're communicating. Their expressions and body language, or using pictures and visuals, are always extremely helpful in communicating when you're talking with someone who's deaf. Deaf people are very social. They love to get together and do activities together in big groups. So they'll have, deaf night at the bowling alley, or, they'll have, Olive Garden meet on the second Saturdays of every month. And like, they'll have tables for 18, 20 people where they can all get together and socialize. And so socialization is a huge part of deaf culture in ASL, sitting around and talking and having a good time. They're famous for their very long goodbyes. Your event might end at, say, 9 o'clock at night, and people might start standing up, but then by the time they actually visit each person in the room and say goodbye and get out, it might be 10, 11 o'clock before they actually leave. And so that's very common in deaf culture, in the deaf community. And deaf people are extremely passionate about ASL and deaf culture. They do what they can to keep it going and keep it live. It's a beautiful culture on all aspects. So you might be thinking to yourself, how do I get involved with the deaf community? Well, learn ASL, take some ASL classes, make some deaf friends, have them teach some signs to you. Remember that for true deaf members who are born deaf and use ASL, English is a second language for them. And so be patient. And, it's okay to write back and forth and try out new signs with them. And just know that English is a second language for them. So, your patience is always appreciated. And then the last thing about deaf culture that I have here is the fact that, my goodness, you just cannot imagine how many famous deaf people have directly impacted our world. We not only have deaf actors and actresses and models, but we have composers. You've probably heard of Beethoven. We have deaf painters and writers and sports players, authors, inventors, poets, educators, astronomers, business people, activists, attorneys, all the things. These are just some images of, we even had a famous spy who was deaf, who was so good at lip reading that they would spy on other countries back in World War II with some of the things going on there. So, I mean, just wonderful, wonderful advances and things that our deaf and hard of hearing community has brought to the world. You should look up famous deaf people or how deaf people have impacted the world. You will be amazed at how much comes up. We're really proud of our deaf and hard of hearing people that have done wonderful things for the world. So deaf etiquette, I thought I would throw some things up here about deaf etiquette and, what are some things to do? What are some things not to do? If you want to get a deaf person's attention, it's safe to tap on their shoulder. You can also, if there's a flat surface near them, you can tap a table or you can wave to get their attention. Don't like stomp really loud or get in their face and wave really big or yell at them. If they can't hear you, they can't hear you, and yelling's not going to help. So yeah, just tapping or just a small wave is absolutely appropriate. Always speak directly to the deaf person. Please don't do oh, hey, can you tell him that I'm going to be there at 4 o'clock tomorrow? That's makes them feel invisible, and that really hurts a lot of deaf people's feelings because they feel like they don't matter, that they're invisible when you do that. So talk directly to them, look them straight in the eye. And if you can't sign, like I said, you can write something down and hold it to them while you're making eye contact with them. That's the best way. Speaking normally at a normal pace is most successful for deaf people who can lip read to lip read your mouth. Do not over enunciate because it distorts the words and it's almost makes it impossible to lip read. And one of the things that I think that it's important to also remember oh, bless you, whoever that was. One of the things I think is important to remember when lip reading is that there are several of consonants that look the same on the lips. So if I say the word bat and I say the word mat, they both look the same, even though they're very different words and they sound the same. So it's hard. There's no way anyone could tell the difference. Some words aren't visible on the front of the lips at all. So like the word king, you wouldn't even know I was saying a word if you were trying to lip read me. So that's what I mean by speech reading is a talent for the words that you can see. You're still not quite getting every word. And the last thing is, of course, if you're in this university type setting, then try to use a platform such as Zoom, like we're using today. It's the most compatible for any kind of video remote interpreting or live captioning services so that we can embed them into the system and you can see them appearing across the bottom of your page. It allows the easiest access for our students to get their accommodations while they're learning online. So that kind of leads me to our deaf and hard of hearing students here at the University of Illinois. What kinds of accommodations do students use here? Well, first, as far as live captioning goes, I want to tell you a little bit of the differences. I think a lot of people get these confused. When we talk about subtitles, we're talking about translating it from one language to another. So you've probably seen that the most on DVDs, or if you're live streaming a movie, you'll go to the subtitles to choose English for deaf and hard of hearing, or you might choose Spanish or some other language, right? Those are subtitles. Closed captioning is when you have an event that's been recorded, a video, maybe you recorded a class synchronously, and then now you have the recorded class. Closed captioning is when you go back in after the event has been recorded and add in the captions afterwards. Live captioning is when someone is typing what's being said in real time as it happens. And that can be provided live, like a person can be sitting kind of like a court stenographer in the classroom, typing everything that's being said. And the deaf student will be reading their captions that are coming up across their laptop. Or we might, if we don't have anyone on campus that can do it, we do have a couple of vendor companies that we work with, and we might have captioners sitting in Nebraska or Arizona or Florida or something that are listening in to your class with hearing aids, headphones, and typing every word that's being said live as it happens. So that's the difference between those three things at the top. And so common accommodations that DRES provides for students who are deaf and hard of hearing are American Sign Language interpreters, preferential seating. So if they are a lip reader or speech reader, they can sit up close to the professor and read their lips. They might need extended time on their exams, especially if they're deaf and English is their second language. They're having to read in English. They might need just a little bit more time to process that and figure out what the question is asking. Sorry, excuse me just a minute. Thank you. But note takers is a very common accommodation. It is very difficult for a student who's deaf or hard of hearing, who's sitting in the front of the classroom, trying to watch the professor's mouth and facial expressions and read, to also try to take notes at the same time. Every time they look down, they've literally missed almost everything that's being said while they're trying to write. And then by the time they look up again, they've missed, and where do you get back, jump back in that way? That's really difficult. So we'll provide note takers. Some of our deaf and hard of hearing students wear hearing aids or cochlear implants, or use microphones or FM systems. Some don't, they choose not to. It depends on the student and what their preference is. We do have accommodations such as flashing fire and tornado alarms and flashing doorbells. So if you work in housing or in any kind of office, we might give a request with FNS to put in a flashing doorbell or any of the alarms. And sometimes not only in the dorms do we need it in their dorm room, but we also need it in the showers and in the bathroom stalls, in case they're in a stall when a fire goes off, or if they're in the shower when the fire goes off, alarm goes off, they need to be able to see the flashing in those areas as well. Sometimes we'll give early access to PowerPoints because they need to be able to kind of read through and try to make sense of what's going to be happening in class today, so that they're prepared and on the same page as their peers when they walk in. And then of course, live captioning for any class discussion or lectures, and then closed captioning on all the videos that are shown in class, or any asynchronous classes that might just be online classes that are not done live. They'll need closed captioning for those as well. I took some pictures here of different equipment that deaf and hard of hearing individuals use, just so you could see what they look like. On the far left-hand upper corner, this is an example of FM systems and microphones that you might see students use. They can either hand it to the professor or aim it and point it at the professor. Down at the bottom left-hand, this is an image of a child with a cochlear implant. Those do have to be surgically implanted to work. And in the center, it's a rainbow of all kinds of different types and styles of hearing aids. Behind the ear hearing aids, ear molds, in the ear canal, all the different types. This top right-hand picture at the top is just an image of a gentleman who is an interpreter and the professor who's talking up at the board. And then this last image is just an example of the live captioning. So in the first row, the person sitting at the end of the table has a laptop or iPad or whatever that they're watching the live captions go across the screen for what's happening in class. And then you can see here that number 2 is the remote captioner, could be sitting anywhere in the world, listening into the class and typing what's being said. And then at the front, the professor is wearing a microphone so that the captioner can hear what they're saying. Yeah. So then I was thinking, as far as deaf and hard of hearing people and culture is concerned, how can people who work with FNS and employees help? Like, what kind of ways can you make an impact and help deaf and hard of hearing individuals at our university? And some of the things that I came up with was setting up rooms for presentations. If you can, make sure that you try not to set the speakers of the event or the interpreters in front of a window. It casts a shadow on their face and makes it very difficult not only to speech read, but to see their hands when they're signing. If the interpreter is present, or if you know that an interpreter is going to be at this event, make sure that you have a space for the interpreter up at the front of the room nearest to the speaker. Prepare a chair for them. If it's an event like convocation, graduation ceremonies, that type of thing, they might even need a music stand so that they can put up all the notes from the speakers, like their PowerPoints or their speech, so that they can have it in writing also while they're hearing it. And it makes it so much easier for them to sign by just being able to glance at that right in front of them, plus all the names they've got to go through. It's kind of hard to know how to spell some of them, so it's easier to see the names if they can have a music stand holding a list of all the names. And setting up your room in a way, if at all possible, where it's not necessarily rows where people are in rows. That makes it more difficult for your deaf and hard of hearing students to see and understand if there's going to be a lot of discussion in the group. If it's just a lecture series, that's one thing. But if the audience is going to be involved in any way, round tables are great. Or setting things up in kind of a semicircular motion so that everybody can see each other, see their face, their facial expressions, read their lips, see their hands if they're signers. Those are some things to consider also. So, ask maybe some questions when you've got to set up a room. What type of event is this? Do you know if any deaf and hard of hearing individuals will be available? That type of thing. And then just being aware of the location of loud fans, air conditioners, doors to the hallways. All that extra noise absolutely does interfere with hearing aids, cochlear implants, or even the residual hearing. So if you can keep the areas reserved for deaf and hard of hearing individuals away from those sources, that's always a great thing. And then I just kind of threw this in there. This is not necessarily my content. This came from Keith Hayes, who is our ADA IT coordinator on campus. Accessibility really is not just making a one-off change to technology or a process. It's not just a feature that you turn on or turn off. Okay, everything's accessible now. Accessibility, it is conformance with legal standards or guidelines, but it's not just that. It's not just arbitrary, and it's certainly not giving an unfair advantage to some. And I'll explain that through the use of this picture. In the first picture over on the left, you've got 3 students who are standing in front of a board, and all of them are receiving the same thing. It's equal. This is equality. They're all getting the same thing, which is nothing. However, you can see just because they're all getting the same thing, it doesn't mean that everyone has access to the board. The first person is trying to reach the board, but he only can barely reach just a little bit, right? The person in the middle is pretty tall, and she seems to do quite well. She has full access to the board, so she's fine. But then the third person is in a, like, was not really a wheelchair, but scooter. But they can't reach the board at all. So they don't have access to the board or to the learning environment in any way. That's equality. So sometimes when you hear people talking about accessibility, oh, well, it's just making everything equal. It's not really just making everything equal or making sure that all of the participants have, you know, equality there. What we're talking about is more adding accommodations, and that's what DRES does. We add accommodations in. We're giving things that will help you, which is what I went over earlier. Live captioning, interpreter, preferential seating, note taker. Those are all accommodations that I went through earlier. So this is a picture, is an example of that in the middle. We gave the first student a box to stand on. Now they have better access so that they can access the board just as well as the person in the middle who already had access. And then we gave a ramp that's even taller than that so that the student who's in the chair now also has access to the board. We've given accommodations to kind of level the playing field so that they can all have true access to learning or education or whatever it is. But what we're really aiming for is the last picture on the right, which is truly accessibility or universal design, if you've maybe ever heard that phrase. It's creating the course or creating the environment and creating the information in a way where everybody can access it from the beginning so that we don't even need accommodations. And that truly is equality when you have true accessibility and everything has been designed with all different types of learning in mind. How can people who maybe can't use their hands or their feet or who have different learning disabilities or hearing loss or vision loss, how can they access the material in my class, or how can they access the event that I'm putting on, my conference or my presentation that I'm putting on? If you're creating it from the beginning with a way for everyone to be able to access it, then everybody is better off in the long run. So I think that that's important just to go over for all disabilities. So I came up with a link of some helpful deaf and hard of hearing links for reference. I've got Gallaudet here, you know, the National Deaf Education Center, demonstration schools, all of the things that are really fun that if you're interested in this and you want to look forward to looking through some different references, I've got a list here for you. And then of course, I've got my name and my contact information at the end. So always, if you have any questions or concerns that you think of even after today, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd love to do what I can to answer or put you in contact with someone who knows more about the particular area than me maybe. But yeah, that's all I have for today. So I know that was a lot, but do you have any questions?
Hi, thanks so much for joining us today. Could you go back to one of your first slides that kind of help as a guideline of what to say and what not to say in terms of terminology? I think that could be helpful to look at again for me.
Sure, it's not extensive by any means. And like I said, things are always changing. Let me share my screen here. There we go. The person first terminology. Can you see it or do I need to make it bigger?
Yes, that's good. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I know a long time ago, they used to call people who are deaf and hard of hearing deaf and dumb, which obviously is very offensive. I know in the 80s and the 90s, people used the word retarded all the time. I know around, at least in the areas that I was growing up at that time, they used it, but obviously that's not acceptable now. Any other questions?
Just a quick thing, like it's I missed this slide earlier, but it seems like to me, I thought saying vision impaired and hearing impaired would be more appropriate than saying you're blind or something.
Right. Well, I will tell you that the medical viewpoint, the medical model still says vision impaired, hearing impaired, because they're basing it off of able-bodied people, right? And so you will likely still hear that. At DRES, the disability office here on campus where I work, we focus on the social model and how people feel about those terms. And so, and this, even just this person first terminology, a person who is deaf or a person who is hard of hearing or a person who's blind, you know, that's what we're using right now at DRES. But I know that even within the special education community and the deaf or disability community, that's it. Really kind of everybody has their own individual viewpoints of, well, I am deaf and that is who I am and it does define me, so I want to be called deaf. Or it really, you know, it's one of those things where you just have to, when you're interacting with people who have disabilities, ask them what term they prefer. How do they identify? And then use that when you're with them. But I don't think that this is inappropriate by any way. It is definitely the social model view. And this is why we do person first for the social model. But then there's, you know, there's a thing called ableism. And that's where everything is centered towards able-bodied people. And ableism is a big topic in the deaf and hard of hearing, but also disability community at this time. And it's not very happily looked upon, ableism. It's more about, it's not about whether or not my body is able to do something, but can I still be a person who has, you know, important and valid thoughts and maybe still participate in different activities, even if I'm in a chair or even if I can't see? Yes. So a lot of the disability community tends to lean more towards the social viewpoint, like DRES does. But yeah, the medical community certainly does say impaired.
Yeah. So just about what you said about ableism. So is it okay to, is it okay to still say able-bodied person to a disabled or person with disabilities?
I personally say persons with disabilities.
Yes. Yeah.
I find that covers everything, whether you're able-bodied or not.
Okay. Cool.
There's no right answer is the answer. Really. It's just trying to keep those things and understanding that others might take offense to things. This isn't like the hard, definitive way you have to do it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments and the questions.
Hey, Tina, real quick, can you talk about just, you know, the student coming to campus for the first time, the resources that DRES have? How do they kind of work with DRES to develop maybe what they would need in way of support for, you know, any of the activities or classes they have set up? And then can you kind of maybe talk about the arc of that relationship as they go through their career at the university?
I certainly can. I'll even show you really fast. Let me switch my sharing screen. Where am I at? There we go. And this is scene 2. Okay, you should be looking at the DRES website right now. Can you all see that? I hope. Can you see it? Okay, so when a student accepts their invitation to come to the University of Illinois and they finalized it and they send in their acceptance of, yes, I'm coming in the fall or the summer or whatever the semester is. Usually if that student has any kind of disability, whether it, you know, deaf, hard of hearing, blind, low vision, or speech, it could also be a different mental health documented disabilities that they have, learning disabilities, ADHD, physical disabilities, maybe other health disabilities, like if students are going through cancer or they have maybe uncontrolled diabetes or any number of things that they could have that rises to the level of a disability. And they know that they're going to have maybe some trouble if they just try to go to their classes without any supports. We're hoping, and they should be, you know, that places like the Office of Admissions and the housing and all of the other places are pushing out our message of, hey, DRES is here. We've got a huge team of people who can work with you. But we also have our website. And so what they do is once they've accepted, they come to our website, which is this. Right in the center of our screen, you see applying for services. So they click on applying for services and they'll get all of the information that they need on how to apply for services. If they have questions, they can call, they can email. And we've got about 8 access specialists like myself. Like I said, I focus only on students who are deaf and hard of hearing and blind, low vision, but we've got other access specialists who only have ADHD students or students with learning disabilities or physical disabilities or all of the things, mental health disabilities. And we all work together because not every student just has one disability. Many students have several disabilities. So they might have severe uncontrolled anxiety that they're working with doctors and taking medications and they're still having trouble. And maybe they're low vision. And so then when that's the case, the access specialist works together like co-managers of our caseloads. But they will fill out a very quick online application that just tells us who they are, their basic information, what disabilities they have, and then how it negatively impacts them. They only have to, they should just write about a paragraph or so, letting us know a little bit about what's bothering, what is the issue for you? What's your barriers? And then they have a way to upload different medical documentation. And so when you go to applying for services, you can see right here, this is the application for DRES services. And then this is the documentation requirements. So depending on the disability, that we have a whole thing of documents that DRES cannot accept. If you have a mobility, systemic, chronic health disability, then these are the requirements that we need. If you have a speech disability or learning disability or ADHD, it takes you and explains exactly what you need. We encourage our students to, take it, highlight their section, copy, cut, paste it, and send it to their doctors. Their doctors should also be able to go through this and give them what they need. And then depending on how they've been, what their primary disability is, depends on which access specialist it goes to. We get all their medical documentation. We go through it all. If we have everything we need, then we reach out to the student and we set up a meeting with that student. We go through the interactive process and we talk about how does your disabilities impact you? What are the barriers for you? And then if it's appropriate for them to receive accommodations, we write what we call a letter of accommodations right then. And that letter is a legal document. It's written by the access specialist at DRES. It's just simply a letter from me to the professors. And it just says, this student is registered with DRES. By FERPA law, we are not allowed to say what their disability is. We are only allowed to say that they do have one and that they've been vetted by DRES. So when you get a letter, you can know that that person really does have the disability they say they have. You do not have to provide accommodations to someone if they do not have a letter of accommodation. And if that happens, we encourage you to encourage them to come to DRES and get registered with us so that they can get those accommodations. But they give those letters to all of their professors. And then we have a huge team and staff of people at DRES. We've got psychologists, licensed clinical social workers. We've got licensed mental health therapists. We've got assistive IT specialists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, people on our team at DRES that work with our students so that they can have the best possible access to life, not just in classrooms, but also SROs, dorm room experiences, life campus experiences. We really work hard to make sure that our students with disabilities have the same access and experience as their peers that do not have disabilities. I know that was a whirlwind, but there it is in a nutshell.
We had one question in the chat here. Do you know over at DRES if there is any interpreters who can accommodate someone whose primary dialect is Black American Sign Language or Black Sign Variation? As we strive for equity in student recruitment and retention, it would be helpful to know about that resource.
Oh, I 100% agree. We've got a couple of interpreter positions posted, and we're looking specifically for as much of a wide range and variety of interpreters, especially an interpreter that can have or utilize a Black sign language, which would be wonderful. Right now, we do not have anybody that's on campus, but I do have an interpreter that does work remotely, who is African American, who has a very good niche in that area. And so they're able to address those current needs as they pop up around the university. It's remote, it's not live, but we do have that person that can give those services if we need it. And we're always looking for more because it's so important. Yes, thank you for asking that question. Well, thank you. If there's no other questions, thank you all so much for spending time with me today. I encourage you to reach out to me if you have any other thoughts or questions that pop into your mind. I've had a really, really great time here with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for joining us and giving this presentation. It's been super helpful, and obviously everyone here is agreeing with that. So again, we really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. You guys have a great rest of your week.